Craig, Saila, and I'll get into a bit more about myself, but I want to like shout out to the familiar faces in the room. There's a bunch of faces in here from different parts of my life and overlapping parts of my life, and it's always great to see that and reconnect. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge the land as well as the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and the original keepers of this land. This treaty that ceded this particular parcel of land is referred to as Treaty 13 of the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting is still home to the Indigenous people across Turtle Island. I am grateful for us to have the opportunity to gather here today and talk. I should also add that I'm not speaking as an official rep of CBC, so assume everything I'm about to say is only theoretically related to my work. And I'm going to pace a lot, I apologize. I just realized that. So we'll go through this. Now, so co-creation. What I'm going to loosely be talking about is the idea that we were jamming on just before this started, that all good design is the act of co-creating, co-developing, working together to actually build something new. And what my particular focus will be on is sort of reinventing or reimagining what design feels like in an agile product-first organization like CBC or CITC or BMO. So I'm Craig, as I mentioned. I spent a lot of years doing a lot of other things before landing where I was. I was a journalist when it was still a career. I was a web developer before it was actually hard. I was a product manager when it was still considered project management. Eventually, I landed in design, and it's then when I kind of realized that everything I had been doing was actually design all the way along. Not in the designer, everyone's a designer kind of sense, but the work I was doing was trying to help facilitate understanding and help people kind of connect to an end solution. And in that spirit, I want to just level set my language for this conversation, for the room here as well. And I also want to invite this to be a conversation. So if you have thoughts, if you have different disagreements, shout them out and yell. Throw things at me if you want. Maybe not. But I do want to really have a conversation if you're feeling into the ideas here. So on to some definitions. One of the things that I found is it's really important to have an understanding and agreement on the words that are being used so that we can actually jump ahead and to the ideas behind those words. And if there's any word that I do use in a context that you don't understand, just raise your hand or lift an eyebrow or twist your head in a weird way, and I'll try to catch that and explain it a bit more. Also, this is probably my 15th coffee today. As some of you may know, I already speak slightly fast. So if I'm speaking too fast for you, feel free to just sort of like slow down, search for the signals in that sense. Looking at you, Kate, thank you. So, Agile. How many people are vaguely familiar with the term Agile? All right. So Agile is, in the way I'm kind of using it here, was sort of a software practice begun in 2000, really as a response to waterfall. It captures sort of these values here, right? Individuals and interactions, producing working software, emphasizing customer collaboration, and responding to change. Lean. Lean in this context is sourced from the original sort of Toyota production system that came about in the 1930s. It was adapted into the North American business market in the 1990s. And then Eric Ries wrote a book in 2012 called Lean Startup, and basically every single digital company thereafter copied its idea, which was essentially build something, measure whether it works, learn from that, and repeat over and over and over. Service. There's actually a couple definitions of service. The first one is that it's really just the service created by the product offering. So if the product's Netflix, the service is the streaming movies that are in there, for example. The second part of service is, shout out to the back row there, service design, which in many ways informs the process that I'm about to talk to. How we connect all the different bits and pieces of the product work together as an entire journey, how those different disparate elements of the system interact to create an overall experience. So I've already used this word a few times right now, product. As I sort of go along in this conversation, I'm sort of bouncing around two definitions for it. The first definition is the idea that it's an object, right? This is the product. Netflix is the product that gets created, as well as a practice. So product management, or product ownership, or product delivery. The act of business projections and managing, prioritizing tasks of product. Design. Again, process of design, role of designer, but it's also, and I will use this a lot, is the idea of design as an idea and as a concept. And I'm sort of struggling with this one. It's a lot like snow, right? It's all contextual. You ask someone if it's snowing outside in April, you're going to know what that snow feels like. In January, it's going to be something else. So bear with me as I mangle design many times over. Product and design. Product design. Product design basically encapsulates the model of production that most digital work we do now entails. Product sort of identifies an opportunity, and design, in collaboration with development, delivers a potential solution to it. So product design. What I am going to touch on today and sort of explore a bit more about and still working on solving for is flipping this notion. Not to put design in front of product necessarily, but to almost imagine plowing a path forward for that continuous development going forward, building through. Design, in other words, should precede the product, not because design is the process, but because design is the process, rather, and product is the outcome of that process. So there we go. I also worked in the States a bit, so I do process and process. I did two different ones in that one. So design should precede product because design is the process, and product the outcome of said process or process. It's really faint light gray. It does say that this is a work in progress. There's a caveat there. This is also not an answer. It's just based on sort of my experiences, so don't look for anything insightful other than the stuff coming out of my mouth. It's literally also just a drawing on my whiteboard, and you may or may not be able to see it coming through, and you can't. So you have to come to my office at some point. You can see that drawing.
It was there.
It was there? You did see it? Okay, good, good. Awesome.
It's like secrets.
It's a secret, yeah. It's a sketchy whiteboard.
Secret ink.
I also realized the map I drew on the whiteboard is harder to produce in line art in Keynote, so that's also why it's not there. I want to pause here just for a second and just see if there's any clarifications or any questions or any thoughts or any question marks you have at this point that you'd like me to help clarify. This is a line. Thank you, and that's it. This is a line, and one of the things that is interesting about this is I sort of like stare on this over and over and over again. It suggests progress or progress in Western culture, right? It moves from left to right, like our reading styles, and up and down. This line can also represent a design process. So this is an example of the double diamond, the classic sort of London Council idea where you've got the idea of discovery and then you diverge into exploring a whole bunch of different opportunities, and then you converge to define the solution to that, and you diverge again to develop potential design solutions to it, and then converge again when you get to the delivery moment. It could also represent the Agile process, right? Where you're building and testing and releasing, iterating over and over and over and getting a better and better MVP. It could also represent a line in a classic product management process, where you have the introduction of a product to market. You have that growth moment where you're really trying to drive that development and the opportunities within that product. Then you have that maturity phase. You kind of figure out what you want to do with it. Do you want to kill it? Do you want to revise it? But it's a line, and essentially it just represents the process of moving an idea from conception to reality. Zoom out a bit more and you have a line that kind of looks like the process I went through making this talk. Sort of starting out with the initial idea, the bumpy ups and downs of like, this is not going to work, this doesn't make any sense. And aspirationally, I'll get to that point at the top of the arrow where I'm like, bang, I actually made sense. Zoom in a bit further and you see a line that represents most of the way we do work in digital organizations now. In particular, product is on the delivery side, on that side of the fence, with Agile and Lean methods guiding what the audience-facing results are. So what the customers get is typically defined by the product side over there. On the other side of the fence, sorry, are you seeing? Yeah, okay. The other side of the fence, you've got a chunk of work that represents the design. They're in the early stages of the conversation. They're talking to, doing user research. They're doing those conversations to understand what the opportunities might look like. But there's a disconnect that results between these two models always, and I haven't not seen this. There's that gap area there. It could be just misconnections in terms of handoffs and different tool systems. It could be garbled jargon back and forth in terms of different words being used for different things. It's what triggers the debate about whether designers should learn how to do code or designers arguing about themselves about form versus function. It's the kind of thing that is exemplified when a tool like Sketch outputs code, HTML code or C# code or whatever it is, that a developer would never ever use. The designer thinks they're doing service. I've got all this code, you can just build it out. The developer looks like it and says, this is absolute trash. It's a gap. The essence of the rest of what I'll be sort of diving into a bit more tonight is how we close that gap. It's really just a chance for product and design to work together to intentionally discover what they can do together to validate solutions. That gap, in my mind, is a shared responsibility, and if no one works on it, neither side will. But if both work on it, something can happen. I want to stop here again just for a moment and say that everything I'm about to say is nothing new. There's a whole bunch of different ideas around that. This is not an original idea. There's a couple other models that have been out there and around before that are worth taking a look at. Dave Landis put this model together a number of years ago, and it's really notable for how it kind of links the design thinking in with the lean process and the agile management. One of the things that I really like about it is how it shows how agile can sit within the loop of that design work, that discovery process work going on. The challenge, though, I've had with it is that design thinking is separated from the execution part. This is a model of the design process married with lean, but it separates the two practices. It emphasizes the practice which creates, for lack of a better word, silozization, privileging the practice over the purpose of the work itself. I'm going to do my design thinking over here, come up with a brilliant idea. It's up to these people to execute on it well. I'm going to execute on it well. It's abstracted from the ideas that I'm working on. This just came out last, I think, Friday. It was published by Jeff God Health, I think is his name. It's a zoom level closer than the model that we were looking at just a moment ago. And it's really designed to show how the Scrum framework works within the design lens. It's actually that nuance of Landis's model where that agile loop is working. This is an articulation of how that agile loop works in practice. If you look a bit closer at it, and some of the words in the post-its you can't quite see in this slide, you'll see that it's actually just design practices and periods overlaid within the Scrum model. Right? So there's a whole bunch of activities around prototyping right in here, and a whole bunch of things around design sprint over here. It's designed, described by a Scrum coach, essentially, to someone who only knows Scrum and Agile. This is a way of sort of breaking it down for them so they can put it together. One of the things I do like about his model is he added a person to the Agile team, which is unique in some organizations. A designer is embedded with an Agile set of software developers. That's a critical part to close some of those gaps, but the dangerous assumption that can be made from this model, not that he necessarily presents it this way, is that that single designer does all of these activities. That designer is responsible for doing the design sprint, the wireframing, the prototyping. You're never going to find that unicorn out there. And by not acknowledging that gap, by not acknowledging the fact that there's a whole level of design practice that's joined here that needs to operate in conjunction with these activities, you end up with a shearing effect that starts happening. You have developers getting frustrated that the insights being generated through the UX practice are too slow and too late, too behind the game. You have designers frustrated that all they're asked to do is cut another copy of a button so that they can get released and get that MVP going through. There's an anxiety between the two because they're not sharing an understanding of how their work fits in when to the process. Both approach the solution in a very practice-specific way. The models have failed in my experience, and I've played with a lot of these different models because they, as I said, they failed to offer a unified shared understanding of why we're doing what we're doing, who's doing it, and how we're doing it. That integration is missing. Without that integration, none of the actual work can get done. Make sense so far? Anything completely blunt and obvious on this? Any rejections of these ideas? Should I keep plowing forward? Awesome. Awesome. All right, so back to my line. I've got some colored boxes on it now you may or may not be able to see. These are light green, these two. This is kind of an aqua, and that's a light blue. Not that the colors really matter. I need to remember that the desaturated colors look amazing on my MacBook, but every single projector washes them all out, and you have to go with bright saturated colors. And I think Apple tries to do that as a default within their keynote, bright, shiny colors that look horrible on my screen that I just ignore when it comes to projection, and that's what you get. Nevertheless, there's two distinct areas in the process. So one is design-led, in my mind, and one is product-led. Then there's that kind of mushy middle right in there. Breaking it down into kind of practice areas and phases of work, I like to think of them, this first stage, as UX. This is the practice. In this room, we all understand what UX is. There's many UX practitioners here, which is awesome. It's the process of talking, understanding what the needs are, having those conversations, really getting to know who the audience is, who the customer is that we're working with. As you sort of advance down that curve and you get that understanding, you're moving a bit more into that product design realm. So UI design, graphic design, where you're starting to stand up something that feels a bit more real to stakeholders. It's the classic D design, right? You know, you're working in Photoshop or Sketch, you're doing real working concepts. Jumping ahead a bit to the product-led portion, that kind of dip and curve represents the build, measure, learn results of Agile. You're working through the process of a release cycle, you get this great product into market, you get depressed because the testing fails on it, and then finally you get a releasable candidate you feel comfortable with, and you're getting close to your MVP. When you hit that MVP movement, then that's where the exciting things happen. I want to narrow down a bit more because it's not just Agile in particular. In this scenario, it's more about product ownership. And I'll break down that jargon just a bit more for us in the room. How many people work in an Agile team environment? Product ownership. Is that a familiar term for people? Who wants to shout out the definition for product ownership? I do, Craig. Okay. So product ownership is loosely around like, the delivery of the product, right? They're prioritizing the tasks in the backlog and working to make sure that what we're working on is the right important stuff to get done. So this area isn't particularly Agile. It's really around product ownership and understanding where the value of the work is. And then finally, we'll get into that product management. You hit that moment of MVP and you push that product out, you hit that growth curve, then you have that maturation curve. So the mushy middle phase. I haven't come up with the name of this, so it's just design plus product. And this is actually sits within the design responsibility in the way of processing work. It's a design-led activity. From a project basis work, that means design, however that's defined, owns the responsibility of championing that work and those activities. But importantly, product is an active member in this, and they're the ones who make the decision on when to move forward. This is a classic handover phase, and sometimes it gets lost in a lot of that nuance where it's just seen as a delivery and product checks off and moves on and does that, or product demands deadlines and design just delivers to it. This is a co-led activity. As you're going through that discovery moment to understand what works and what doesn't work, there needs to be an active conversation and a tension point. Product makes the decision on when it's going to take on the lead of that space. By breaking it into phases like this, we have clear decision points all the way throughout the effort. And these decision points are intentional decision points, intentionally grouped here based on a practice area, but actually developed more around the kind of work that's getting done. UX decides when they think they have an understanding of when those unmet needs are identified, what that job to be done is. They make that decision and say, we've got it, we know what the opportunity is here. Product now start building out concepts and designing, exploring those areas. Product design then picks up that work and says, okay, we've got something here, we're going to play with a bunch of concepts, we're working on it, we're jamming up with it, we've got it locked down. We've got something that we're actually comfortable throwing out into the real audience to test. There's that decision moment. They make that handover. Then, as we talked about, we have that design product, mushy middle area. Within product ownership, it's that the cadence of the Agile cycle built in, or the Kanban cycle gets built in. The release moment is decided by that product owner. When they think they've got an MVP or enough value to deliver the customer, they'll hit that release button. That may be timed by a Scrum or a sprint schedule, or maybe it's timed by something else, but it's owned by a product owner to move that forward. They're making the decisions not necessarily by the quality of the aesthetics of the experience or how well it necessarily meets the user need. They're looking at their own metrics to determine that success. It's all a shared decision, because one of the important things about this is every group needs to be represented throughout each of these phases. So in the UX phase, it's UX design led, but product management is there. Strategy, or some component of strategy, needs to be there to understand and guide why and who to talk to when. And research should be there to be able to get the data and make sure that you're talking to the right people. Again, yeah?
Is product management also business?
It could be business, yeah. I mean, so that's one of the challenges with one of these areas. So in the lens that I'm using right now, product management, I'm thinking product managers or product owners, and strategy being kind of a business owner. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So I'm wondering whether you use the term product a lot.
Yeah.
And so on the previous slide, it was a phase. I'm wondering whether what you mean on the right-hand side with product roles is delivery roles. Because to me, product is like what you mentioned, product management, product ownership. But I'm confused now because product roles, or is this a timeline that you're...
I'll come through to that, but yeah, let me pull on that, because that's a really important nuance. One of the gaps that I've seen a lot with both design and product is that exact question. Typically, product management is a business practice role in terms of figuring out either strategic questions and identifying stakeholder needs, or looking at product ownership. How that gets grouped together is, in this part of it, is a role. So this is a person, represents a person. Product is not necessarily about delivery, it's also about in-market activity. So once the product is in market, how do you manage and manage the growth and delivery of that space, or that service? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that, but is this a timeline on the horizontal?
Sort of. If I don't answer your question in a few slides, come back to me on that. Okay. Next in line, we've got the product design phase. So participants in this should be actually led by product design roles, and even if it's not a different person, it's the person who does the UI design, with UX sitting as an active voice in that effort, and product management, again, is there as a role. In this middle stage, the prototype phase, the design and product phase, product design and product management are in that co-conversation point. So product designer, or the product design role, may be leading the work and thinking about championing that work, but again, it's the product management that decides when that work is done. So the product manager role will decide that. Research and development are often good allies to have at this particular phase, because if the developers or engineers are aware of the work that's getting done, then they can help guide product in deciding that this is feasible or not. And research can be a good objective check and balance against the aspirations of both sort of the aesthetic beauty of product design and the the rationality of product management. Agile phase is just your classic Agile team. So you've got a product manager or a product owner there, developers, and again, like God help said, having a product designer embedded part of that Agile team becomes really important. So product design is an embedded part of that team. And then the in-market phase. Once that product is in market or you're considering that in-market activity, you're looking at product management leading and guiding that role. But the activity is very different than Agile work. I'm not going to dive too far into product work, but this looks at marketing. It talks about research. It looks at strategy. This is about building and growing the audience for the product that you've created, not necessarily getting it to market. Importantly, UX design needs to play a role in this part of the conversation. And the reason why they need to be a part of this conversation is that they are critically the voice of the customer. They started out by doing those research conversations and understanding who those people are. And if they're not actively part of the conversations as you're getting into the marketing and the research activities, you're losing the intent. And I'll come back to that a bit more in a second. So to your point, well, it's sort of set up as a sequence here. We've got UX, product design, design of product ownership, and product management. In reality, at any given moment of time, these are almost layers of activities. Multiple channels or swim lanes of work that's going on. Decisions are getting made and quickly passed along to every parallel track as you move along. Ideally, in a mature organization, those decisions happen pretty rapidly and there's not a big gap between them. And that's important because you've got so many shared roles within those different activity layers that they can start asking questions of each other as they go through it. Whoops, I'm jumping ahead too far. So, for example, if product design has a question around UX with a wireframe, they can quickly throw those questions back and forth to each other in synchronous. If product management gets stuck at a potential in-market problem, they've launched a product, the audience doesn't like it, they have no opportunities how to do it, they can quickly jump up to the UX team and say, hey, we need some help here. This is the area that we're trying to work with and manage. Again, it helps sustain sort of the overall process of the product itself because they're all connected to each other. I think I've already talked about this slide a fair bit, so I'm going to skip through it. Another way to look at this is almost it's an iterative product development across different channels, with each phase informing the speed, direction, and purpose of the others as they go along. Again, these are fairly faded, so I apologize. But the general idea is that you've got a swim lanes of activity going across the UX line, swim lanes of activities going across the product design, the product management, and they're all generally interrelated back and forth to each other. Does that sort of address? Do you want to pull that a bit more?
No.
Okay. Anyone else want to pull at that? Conversations? Nope. Okay. When it gets down to work, this is what it kind of looks like in real life. So if we imagine this as a serial set of activities going forward, and there's our little process that I just kind of walked through there, there's an input point. There's an input point here where there's a decision to whether to reinvest in the product, to keep that product going, or decline that product overall. And it's at that point where you want to re-engage with the design process to say, hey, like what's going on? What are the opportunities for us to do work in this space? In a portfolio level, this kind of conversation would feel like this. So portfolio level, I'm talking about product management, having conversations with strategy, business teams, that kind of level of effort. The problem is identified at the life cycle decision point, and then the opportunities are reviewed. Yes, we should actually reinvest in this product. We think there's an opportunity here, but we don't know necessarily what the solutions are. UX, because they have a seat at that table, they're already aware those conversations are going on, so they're should actively be starting to have conversations around spinning up new research processes, audience segments to talk to, how to have those conversations. And also revalidating some of those user jobs and stories that are created. Do they still hold true? Have we met those have we met those user needs that we identified earlier? Product design phase, we're looking at them in parallel, sort of looking at some of the older concepts that are revised, some of the riskiest assumptions are developed at this point. How many are familiar with the riskiest assumption test? Okay. The riskiest assumption test, design sprints? How many people are familiar with design sprints? Okay, a few people. So the general idea with the riskiest assumption test, and this is another key factor with these models, is that typically in design, we work in a consensus-based approach. So we'll develop something, we'll stand up some wireframes, we'll put some ideas together, we'll show them to some stakeholders. Stakeholders will look at it and go hem and haw, make the logo smaller, that line thicker, add another link here, where's my sponsor link, where's my logo? And eventually we get to a product design that feels okay. It also gets flattened out in consensus within A/B testing or multivariate testing. So you have a great concept, you throw it out in the market, and whatever gets the most clicks is the one that wins in a very, very simplistic standpoint. With the riskiest assumption test, or the model of pushing forth the riskiest idea, one of the opportunities within the product design phase is to actually push out those crazy ideas. You know things are going to get flattened out as you go through this product management cycle, as you do all these A/B testing, as you show it to stakeholders. Go crazy. This is the opportunity for product design to take those insights that UX has generated, those opportunities that UX has identified, those paths and patterns that UX has worked on, to build out a model that is a little radical or very radical, that does something that would make everyone feel potentially uncomfortable. Because in the spirit of constantly testing, as we move into the prototyping phase, you're taking those ideas, throwing them out into market, either testing them with real users, testing them in A/B scenarios, and you're seeing what works. In a best case scenario, your riskiest assumption wins. And you're making a product that differentiates your experience from everyone else that's going on out there. You can always chase the competition, but if you get ahead of it, it's harder for them to catch up. And it's hard to make those leaps unless you take risks. This provides a bit of that insulation to make those risks and move forward on that space. That's why the prototype phase here feels so bumpy. That's why it's so critical to have product design pushing the barriers and having product management coming through and saying, these are the business objectives. In a good working relationship at this particular opportunity, you can really challenge one another. Product management can say, hey, we need to add 4 million new people onto here. And product design can say, well, we can do something insane. Why don't we turn our whole app into a camera screen? That's never going to work. And then Snapchat gets born. Like these kind of like leaps of faith become interesting because they're co-creation moments. They're moments where product design can say, we have a whole bunch of insights around what our users are doing. We have a whole bunch of expertise around creating experiences that are new and embrace what our audiences are really genuinely looking for. And we think they might add some value to you. Product management is coming at that lens and saying, well, we have to deliver business value and we need to deliver it fast. Here are our constraints that we're looking at, budget, time, whatever it may be. By doing fast prototyping of some very risky ideas, you get some really fast learnings in that area. You get product design, gives product management more confidence that they might actually be able to grow that curve a lot faster. And product management helps provide some of those guardrails and constraints that enables product to design to figure out how fast can I move. If you're speeding down a road and you know where the dotted lines are, you can aim pretty fast. If you don't know where those curves are, you need to slow down. So part of the design phase at this point is to really challenge the risky ideas. Look back at the ideas that you threw away that didn't work, pull them back out again, work with UX to try to identify, does this still address those user needs, and stand them up in real prototypes. With that in hand, you can move on to the traditional Agile phase and iterate and move through the MVP process and build out to an MVP. And eventually you'll get into an in-market phase where you launch that MVP, you market and notify users, you stand up commercials, you buy ads, you do whatever you need to do, but messaging to drive that growth. That's how it looks like as a sort of strategy portfolio level work. If you step down a bit lower into how it looks like on a team level, So if you're working on an Agile development team or any of that kind of team level activity, you've got still the consistency of each phase, and that creates a bit of stability. So everyone knows what's happening when and who's doing what when. And they also understand the reason that they're participating in each of those phases. And because the team members are listening in at each of those phases in different ways, they have empathy for it. The developer can feel the pain of the designer who's having to struggle with that old version of Photoshop that they still have to work with, and they realize how hard it is to export out a series of assets. The designer, on the other hand, can feel the pain of the developer who still has to build out for IE 11 and the constraints that are built into there. That empathy breeds trust and safety, and also which enables the team overall to, again, do that riskier stuff. So on a team level, it may be as simple as that moment where you've released that MVP, you're in the product backlog management meeting, and your product owner adds a new story to the backlog. That story may have come from something she heard from a stakeholder who said she wants a logo bigger, or it may come from an insight that she's gathered based on looking at some business needs. There's an opportunity for us to grow our product here. UX can just do a survey of existing data. I know UX researchers often have, almost always have, a whole bunch of research data that they haven't had a chance to synthesize or analyze or dive into. There's always a whole bunch of patterns and plans and structures that are available to access into here. And there's always, if you're in a customer-facing tool, there's user feedback. User feedback in emails or tweets or faxes are incredibly valuable insights to help us in the UX practice understand how close or how far apart we are from that core user need that we're trying to meet. What's that pain process in their experience of using the digital products that we're creating? Again, product design phase. This is, we're designers here, but to play it out, it's like developing wireframes really quick. It's like those quick sketches of wireframes in 5 minutes, playing around with those crazy ideas. It's throwing something against the wall and just riffing on it. It's potentially even just refactoring graphics and moving ahead or changing a gradient here and there. It's this sort of grunt level work that's playing really fast, exploring with these ideas quickly and collaboratively with both UX and Formient, and developer kind of sitting over the shoulder and saying, oh, what is it? Does that make sense? Like that graphic can't work, or that color's not safe, or whatever it may be. The prototype phase is a fun phase that kind of blurs together, that typically gets dismissed as a checkpoint area. And in my view, this is the phase where you have the most opportunity to win over converts and explore ideas. So it could be an Envision share, right? You just stand for prototype. How many people are familiar with Envision? Okay. So Envision is just that prototyping tool. You can share that out with users, see if that works, see if that flow works. If you're using Sketch or Experience Design, you can stand up that prototype there and walk through. Did you missing any buttons? Are there any opportunities there? And if you have that right team, a part of it, they're starting to listen for things. They're getting smarter to listen to those things. They'll see what's not getting clicked, what's not getting open. And that provides insight to build out new prototypes and new explanations within that space. Paper prototyping is another great model of that, even faster version of it, right? Because you're lowering that trust level. We are typically, especially in Canada, not willing to criticize people. We tend to very silently listen to what's being said and just validate what you're hearing. And paper prototyping is a great way to get through that because it's a sketch. No one's going to have hurt feelings if you criticize it. So you can use some of these tools to break down some of the inherent barriers, to test your assumptions. And product management can use this as an opportunity to do pre-validation market testing. If they're inviting their stakeholders into a prototype test, if they're sharing out the results of these tests, they're suggesting and highlighting and teasing out opportunities for future growth. They're showing their stakeholders why that one task is really important because users really care about it. And they're also saying, based on some of these 5 or 6 simple tests we're seeing, we've actually got a really opportunity to move this MVP faster to drive some real features. It's a true opportunity for collaboration that oftentimes gets dismissed as a UX test or just as a checkpoint, as I said earlier. The Agile phase, we are not developers here, but essentially there's tasks assigned. There's something called Jira. We do some Jira work and develop tasks and we release tasks and we validate them, and build the needed components that gets out to that release at the end of the sprint. And then the in-market phase within a team level is that story gets completed, right? We mark off that as validated. We release that with the proper analytics in place, and then we just see how it gets done. And then we move back ahead to the next lifecycle section. I'm going to pause here for a second. Any questions at this point? Like, this isn't a crazy idea, but I just always get worried with quiet rooms. How much is that familiar for people? Heads, nodding, yes, yes.
It seems it's like kind of an ideal state.
Yeah.
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 Where it's like, I think I'm used to more like messy everything.
Where do you see your mess happen?
Everything.
Awesome. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm thinking that the bumpy part in the middle is not the only bumpy part. It's
Yeah.
where you said that there are stakeholders and UX design and product management at each of those phases. Those meetings overlap each other for various different things, and then sometimes it's different parts of the same product, sometimes it's a different product entirely. You're acting as a consultant within the whole group, or it's much messier than can be represented in one chart.
For sure. Does that reflect other people's experiences? Yeah, seeing nods. Yeah, it's true. Like, I mean, I'm not going to, as I said, this isn't an answer. Maturity is really, really hard in this model. It's possible. When it's able to work in tandem, you're able to deliver some really good results. Part of it is building one of the shifts that is working around that idea that it is that co-creation, that collaboration. And one of the big challenges that I've seen over my work experiences is around that trust and that empathy and that opportunity to actually pause and listen. And one of the challenges is sort of like the push me pull you from Dr. Dolittle, right? You've got the two animals sort of driving ahead and trying to pull in opposite directions. And one of the big problems in a lot of organizations is that those are set up to necessarily in opposition to stretch them apart. And sometimes strategy can be there, sometimes a voice can be there to sort of bring them together. But what I've seen is it's not an external process. You can't bring in another person to say you need to work together. And that's the real challenge. That's why I use the word maturity very intentionally. It requires a lot of product managers to say, I need help. And it requires us as designers to understand how to respond to that help in the right way. It takes a lot of humility to sort of say, okay, here's a failure point within this system. I want to deliver this, but I can't deliver this. Product typically has the permission to slow things down. Design typically has the permission to talk to the audience and understand what those needs are, identify some patterns in design areas in that sense. What happens is there's a slight feedback loop that can often happen, I've found, because again, going back to that conversation point, design is saying, but we haven't talked to enough users, or we haven't validated this test, or this design's too complex. And the words that the product manager is hearing is delay, deferral, too much work, I need to move faster, you're just whining, push ahead. They're used to, and especially in an agile context, tuned to listen to developers, right? There's a bug in the code. How many people are familiar with technical debt, the term technical debt? What about design debt? A few people, okay. It's not a common term, right? We don't use this as designers saying we've got design debt here that needs to be resolved. Product management and product ownership in particular within agile organizations and lean organizations are optimized for delivery, fast delivery, iterate on that product, fix bugs, move out product faster, release more code. Design has struggled for a long time within this space to understand how to manage that conversation. And what I essentially have found in my experience, what I'm trying to share it here in vague ways, is it needs to be an invitation. It needs to be inviting product to actively sit in and participate with the conversations. It needs to be us as designers to figure out how to speak in a language that can get heard. Even if it feels uncomfortable for us from a design standpoint, to understand what the business language sounds like, so we can actually deliver that in a way that product can hear it, so then they can then give us the permission we need to move forward.
So Craig, what would that sound like? You gave like 3 examples of things designers say.
Yeah.
So let's pick one of those, and what would that sound like in a language a product manager could understand?
Yeah, so one of the things that I found useful is, how many people are familiar with the value proposition framework? Hands up around there. So that is a very powerful tool I found to sort of close that gap. So identifying the jobs to be done, and so it's a circle with the jobs to be done, and a square with the feature values. And there's gains and pains within the jobs to be done, and pain creators and pain relievers and gain creators in the value proposition. And that is really a user-centric tool. Right? We're talking about the audience-first experience. What's their job? What's their unmet need? What delights them? What surprises them? What annoys them? What are their pains in those moments? We can talk in that pretty clearly. You have a few interviews, you observe a few things, you watch some usability tests, and you're able to understand what that looks like. By flipping it around and adding that value proposition square to that side, we're then able to translate that into product features. Product has a list of features with gain creators. This will drive your business metrics. This will reduce your business metrics. By mapping those together, you can start aligning some of those conversations. So at a high level, that's one way to look at it.
So for example, if I said, I need to do more user tests on feature X, my product owner understands that to be a delay tactic. Is that the risk?
Potentially, yeah.
Potentially?
Yeah.
So I could turn that around and say, so for feature X, we want to do this, but the results so far are inconclusive as to whether it provides any benefit. Like, what would be the trying to get really
complicated here? Yeah, let's see if we can get like really narrow and like, specific using a generic example.
Yeah.
A login button.
Yes.
Right? So we have a login button screen experience. There's an email line, there's a password line, there's a button. We know that from a testing levels that the language is wrong for the buttons, the form fields are confusing, and the validation doesn't really work. We've gone through 5 or 6 or 7 different user testing scenarios, and we've seen 6 of those fail. There's always been that struggle in that moment. Product management wants to push it and get it through and get it done. And why they care about that is because they need to get it to market so they can launch the app, so they can get the registered users, so they can start pushing out email messages on their particular product. In that scenario, what you're looking for from a design standpoint is understanding where their pain point of the product manager is. Right? The product manager's pain point is, I need to reach 40 new customers at the end of this month to hit our business targets. What design needs to find a way to do, and it depends on the person in the conversation, is unpack what that pain for that product owner is and translate it into a potential design opportunity. So in that scenario, if you want to reach those 40 potential new users, but your email form is failing, you may still hit that number, but you're going to be annoying a potential huge amount of your audience in that space. We've seen 6 of the people run through this test, be frustrated and leave the app after doing that. That's 6 people that are going to be harder to win back. If you're part of that larger conversation, you can then even say as a designer to say, I heard from marketing that the cost of acquisition for our new audience is $15 to get a new customer. If these are our loyal customers, why not just fix it right now, even if it means delaying a bit the product? I'm not a math person, but I'm sure you could do some math and figure out where the ROI in that is. And just even pausing to have that conversation is important. The product manager actually may say in that scenario, no, we're going to go ahead with it, whatever. And then as a designer, what we can do is, well, let's add a success metric to that. right? Let's say, measure how many people have successfully logged in and see if we can improve that in the next iteration cycle.
How many people drop off?
Yeah,
Don't register.
exactly. And then you've got sort of that product success metric. Again, if we go back to, let's move ahead, go back to that product curve phase in this state, you've got that success metric that a UX designer can hold on to and share out with to a product owner and say, remember when we were looking at sort of the login state and we were thinking it's not working? Well, remember way back we did a couple of those usability tests and the product manager said, oh yeah, that's right. Well, why don't we think about exploring a new design for that? So that's one example of how it can work. From a product management standpoint, it can often be make the logo bigger. Design going, are you kidding me? Make the logo bigger? Product can come to the table and say, well, remember we've got marketing, we had that conversation with them and there's a big, hypothetically, a new president comes in and decides to rebrand an entire product and you have to like change it on the fly. It's a waste of design effort. You're throwing away a lot of work. But design has that empathy for the product manager because they can see the product manager doesn't care about it. It was another request coming through and just building up that trust in that level in that area. Again, it's nothing, I mean, it's nothing magical. And that's why I really struggled, to be totally frank, I really struggled with this. This was also my process with this talk. I mean, part of the reason why I was different is because I don't know what to talk about. But I also know that this is an insight. It's one of these soft skills, and I'm challenged with you both, and I will confess here, that internally, within my work, translating this into a formal practice that can be repeated when it's just a feeling. You know, it's that feeling of what it feels like to work on a really effective team. And standing up a design practice and a product practice in sync to move ahead is the thing that we all try to achieve, to move ahead. You want to work on those great teams that do that space. And one of the things that I've struggled with, not that this is going to become a whole confessional, but with all the different models that we've seen evolve through, is they're standing up this lens. Here's how, as a Scrum coach, I would approach design process. Here's how, as an MBA or MFA trained with a design degree, I would stand up my Agile approach. And they're very prescriptive, they're very descriptive, but they don't recognize the reality of our work. Good teams function because they trust and collaborate on each other. Building up good teams and building that from an organizational level where you've got trust and collaboration across those scales, all of a sudden you have development teams that trust product teams, that trust design teams. It doesn't really matter how you staff them, it becomes an org design question. But the heart of it is through transparency across these steps, inviting people in and welcoming them in, and making sure they understand what we're doing and why we're doing, and who owns that decision. Who has the expertise to understand when we know enough to move forward. That conversation is the hardest conversation to have, and I don't believe it is a full framework, right? It's not a model like this. It's a mode of thinking that I typically use to move through, and I've seen it work in a bunch of different areas. I skipped 2 slides. I'm not gonna bring them back in. Because I didn't want to do this, but I'm gonna do it anyways. I had a slide of Steve Jobs in 1997. He's like pointing out like this. And I hate using Steve Jobs' analogy when it comes to design and product because it is like the ultimate cliche on so many levels. But I keep watching this clip over and over and over again in my head. It was 1997 when he comes back, when he came back to Apple. And he sits down for 5 minutes and he talks about network computing and how when he comes home to his computer, he logs into his home directory and all his files are there. And when he shows up at work at Next or Pixar or Apple, all he does is log into his home directory and all his files are there. He doesn't have to worry about if he left the file on his home computer or not. He talks about this from a product standpoint in this conversation. He's talking about a business problem. He's got so many different computers, so many different companies, he never knows where he's going to be. So that's a problem that he has. It took them 20 years to develop the iCloud. saving programs. I open my pages, I open this Keynote right now. It's on my laptop, it's on my phone, it's on my work computer. It's an intentionally designed experience that comes from a design mindset with a product mentality. So when I say maturity is hard, Apple took 20 years to pull something like that off, and that's a relatively simple thing with a clear vision driven by a dictator. In our scenarios, in our work, it's a lot harder to do. So what keeps me going is those small moments where when the teams that I'm working with have those slight connections, where they say something and product hears it and is able to get it to market, where product makes a suggestion and you have that jamming session. And you know what that energy feels like when you're in that space. You're in that room, drawing on the whiteboards, sketching out ideas and jamming out on that area, but you've got everyone part of that room. And I think that's where the essence of what we can bring as a design practitioners and design experts into the conversation. Because if we bring, especially from the UX practice, we bring that empathy, that listening, that open stance into the conversation to suggest how we can evolve product methodologies, we're in a lot better place. We don't have to be looking to others for answers, but we can help guide, coalesce, synthesize, and suggest new approaches forward. This is one that I've tried that I found relatively useful, that the model holds in my head. I had a heck of a time translating it into anything legible. I appreciate your patience and understanding, and I would love to converse more on this stuff if people have energy or explore particular ideas. But I want to thank you for time, for allowing me to sort of spew at you for the past 50 or so minutes and challenge you on a cold Monday night. So thank you very much. Am I crazy? You're debating it. I can see it in your eyes. You're like, no, baby.
Whether you're crazy.
I think you really nailed it, that there is a disconnect in between that it's almost in the language itself, it's a handoff between the design phase and the delivery phase, and or at least in the sort of building what's going to roll out. And I've been trying to figure out, is the disconnect that Agile came about as a developer-driven solution and we're just trying to play catch-up now that everyone jumped on board, or is it that there's a sort of a niche in that gap that just hasn't been resolved yet, and we just have to articulate it, and we just have to start delivering on that skill set. So,
yeah, I mean, Agile, I think was designed to expedite waterfall software development. It was a design problem for that particular solution, and it did a good job of that, right? Like, we were able to move out products faster. We don't have software release cycles. We don't have, the idea of big bang software releases don't exist at all anymore. What has changed in a different lens is that software development now has matured. We've got down to nuances of improving the practice around CI and CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment, automated testing, and now it's looking to sort of swallow up other practices. Well, design can be more efficient, made more efficient if we do certain things in that area. And I think that's where some of that tension is. It's not that we've been operating this different track altogether. It's now that we're kind of getting pulled into a track under their terms and forced into that particular model. And yeah.
And it's a model that had not accounted for certain practices in the...
It's a software development, yeah. It's a software development model, for sure.
So, yeah, so I appreciate that you described it not as a skill set, but as a conversation, as a that flow of a good team. But I think we need to figure out, well, what is it that makes that happen, and how do we get past the other friction points? Like, design it like it's a product. Here's a pain point. What are some of the pain relievers we can think up, and then let's test them and iterate.
I think, if I were to build on that one, I think that my pain point around that idea is that there is a solution. I don't think there is a solution. I think part of the challenge that we face within digital design in particular is that we don't have a singular way of doing things. We're not editorial designers producing a newspaper on a regular basis. We're not industrial designers producing a chair on a regular thing. There are patterns and practices we can repeat over and over again, but it's not a singular practice. We're learning as we go, and we're evolving as we go because the tools are evolving so rapidly. And I think it's very dependent on the organizations. We've got a few people from banks here. I would hazard a bet that the way those banks operate are completely different from one another. And probably the practices are very different. The solutions are very different in that sense. I know from my experience in different companies, we have the same sort of steps, but the org design is different. The value structure is different. And if we want to do design well from that audience-centered need or that customer-centered need, we have to identify who the customers, the clients are of that particular business. And those are very unique and very distinct people. And they differ from product to product. The CIBC customer is different than the BMO customer is different from the RBC customer because of brand affiliation or wealth or positioning or whatever it may be. And the design solutions that we're bringing in from a truly user experience design practice cannot be standardized in a lot of ways. The process and the tools that we use to do it, the steps that we use to do it can be, but the methods that we use to come to that solution, I don't think can be standardized.
I thought one of the interesting things you did was connect, as I forced you to go through that.
No, I appreciate it, thank you.
Was to make a really explicit connection between user goals or user failures and testing with business goals. Yeah. Right? To put those two in a room and to make either side look at what's important to the other and say, how are we going to reconcile these, right? That very goal-driven, so it's not, you don't care about users or you don't care about making money. It's like, we're working to goals that need to coordinate. Together.
I appreciate you pulling at that for me because I mean, again, this is these voices banging around in my head a lot, and sometimes you get trapped in an office and I talk to you about it. So it's true though. I think that's where some of the joy happens, right? The surprise and delight moments happen. Is that in that sort of bridging of those two worlds in those extreme conditions? Yeah, for sure.
I kind of wonder if the model of Agile, kind of subsuming everything around it, being driven by software, which is because of pure economics, that the most expensive thing about any big project for the last 20 years has been money spent on software coding work. And so the framework is trying to solve the biggest piece of the goat traveling through the snake, kind of at a time. And I think that
so design is now the answer.
Yeah. So basically, as design becomes more expensive as part of the overall equation.
That's a great Monday thought.
Well,
sorry. No, but it's true. If you look at that optimization, right?
That's probably why it's being so powerful. Not to say it's not got a lot of value to it, but just kind of think about why would there be such an emphasis on some of the things in Agile, iteration, speed, delivery, buying down risk. It's because risk
mitigation.
So maybe it's also just finding a design thinking framework that uses some of those terms. But probably also just an acknowledgement that in the period of time in which we're living, the biggest digital problem is being the cost of software. And so kind of both the in-market piece and the design piece have kind of been lesser players for a while, and that may change. Change.
And I think that's where I play a lot, around with A/B testing or multivariate testing, as some people know. I tend to use that a lot as that riskiest assumption test validation point. From a design standpoint, it allows us to push ahead with design. From a UX standpoint, it allows us to get some insights from it. From a product management standpoint, it gets stood up as an opportunity to try something they may want to that their stakeholders don't want to see. And on the flip side too, it can also be an opportunity for stakeholders to try something that the team doesn't think is a good idea. Let's make that logo bigger and see if people click on it and no one does it. So in that sense, I think it becomes an opportunity to sort of potentially a whirlpool to capture some of those risks in a way that's safe in a design lens. You had a question in the back?
Yeah, I know that Scrum is only like one type of Agile, but I'd be curious to see where some of these Scrum ceremonies and artifacts kind of fall along that line.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's so that Scrum model that I stood up from, I think, Jeff Gothelf has a good breakdown of it. But typically you'll see within the backlog, that's where oftentimes you'll see product design tickets getting flowed into that space. So there'll be a backlog of tasks from a product design standpoint that stand-up needs to get done. So built out prototypes, because Scrum privileges buildable results. Yeah. UX is hard because it's a bit abstract. So UX almost feeds into the insights behind the user stories that Scrum creates. So as a user, I want a TV that I can turn on. How do users turn on their TVs? Let's look into all those different opportunities. Well, the product design builds up that switch. So the product design feels like an input into the backlog often. Some of the success metrics, though, in a well-functioning design and Scrum standpoint, are derived from user experience tests. So we ran a bunch of usability tests, and they informed us that this and this and this is what success looks like and feels like, or user experience from page load time or speed to load time. Those become success metrics that validate the output of those Scrum cycles. So in that kind of intermediate step, when you've got design, product and user experience design embedded within a Scrum team or an Agile team, you can provide a lot of real value to say, let's break out of the development mentality and look at some of the more bridge level activities that inform what those stories build out. In a Kanban process, which is more like a work do, typically what you'll see is a stream dedicated design task. So eliminating design deaths will be one of those particular streams, and a developer or designer will potentially grab a ticket on that one to say, we need to change the color from green to red. We're going to own that ticket and walk through it. Does that make sense? Yeah. Can I expand on that, clarify?
So like, for example, like user stories often are influenced by many different groups, including design.
Yeah.
So I guess like where do you see like should design kind of influence those more, or is it more like working off of the user stories that we're kind of given, or
co-create them? Like I know it seems so cheesy, but I genuinely I think a good functioning Scrum and Agile team, the stories are understood and unpacked and decomposed collectively as a team. And if you have product design and UX design as a part of that team, the decomposition and the construction of that story necessarily takes that input. So as a user, I want a cup of coffee that will keep me awake. Who's that user? Who do they look like? Which audience segment are we tracking? Understanding what that is. What's the data into that? Well, as a user experience researcher, I spoke to 5 people that like to drink coffee, and typically they like hot coffee in the morning, whatever it is that adds into that. So everyone now has that model of who that person is, that user, to understand, oh, they're bearded hipsters that ride bikes. Okay, we've got it. That's who we have to make coffee for. Aging hipsters. And then from a product design standpoint, they're adding that input. What kind of coffee? Are we talking just like an espresso? Are we talking like a venti or grande? Like, what's that feel like? What's that look like? To get that visual in mind, we're talking small coffee. Now the developers are starting to think about, say, okay, well, how do we break down those pieces? So if they're talking about a bearded cyclist who wants a small coffee, I need to make sure that my coffee mug isn't built to be super heavy. So everyone's a part of that story and that creation. So the user story doesn't become an abstract sticky that moves across the board that one person weighs in on. It's something that becomes real and actionable for everyone. And that's where, from a user experience design, we can really bring that to life. We can tell what those stories feel like and help make those stories feel alive. The downside of bad Scrum is that it is tokenism. You will get a story that says, I want a small coffee that will keep it warm enough to keep Craig awake so he can have a conversation later on Monday night. And you will literally build this, right? That's a failure of Scrum. That's how a lot of stories do get run. So design can bring that opportunity to challenge it and actually bring a lot more creativity and draw out the insights from developers and product in that area. Does that help a bit more? You can say no. Yeah, Anna.
I have a question about the public service algorithm.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, totally. So,
can you repeat the question?
Yeah, I will. The public service algorithm. So, I've had a couple talks and sort of talked a bit about this in the past. It's one of the things that our team at CBC Digital is working on. And it's the idea that bursting filter bubbles. So if we, as the CBC, are mandated to inform, enlighten, and entertain all Canadians, how can we do that in a way that doesn't ferment disconnect? How do we develop a personalization recommendation system that recommends stuff in a safe and comfortable way? From a design standpoint and from a product standpoint, what it feels like is privileging the experience of the people in a way that makes, that doesn't create anxiety, really, is how I boil it down to. We don't want to create a designed experience that drives anxiety and habituated addiction for the sake of habituated addiction. We need to design a system that fires at the right level of notifications at the right time, that informs the right audience at the right time, that turns things off at the right time and the wrong time, and we need to do it relatively transparently. As a government entity or government adjacent entity, it becomes really critical. The factor of trust layers a lot into how we perceive product and design within our space, because that's one of the fundamental tenets or values that we need to drive towards. Is this weakening or strengthening trust? And from a design lens, we translate trust as a transparency with the user, with the intent of the design to the output of the design, and loosely values based on, is it meeting those audience needs? So privileging the audience need experience over the business need experience, which sometimes in our lens enables us to say no to some things and focus on some other things. We use that as a focal point for us to focus on, as opposed to, say, revenue or profit in those areas. An intention to, yeah, but not completely. So we know that through scale, we can't build out an infinite number of web pages. When you and I worked together, we were building out standalone web pages for every single website that we did, and we can't do that anymore. Right? That scale doesn't exist. So if you're automating it, if you're giving the machine permission to create templates and designs and systems and cards and patterns to reuse over and over and over again, what are the rules that you're building into that system that says use this template this time versus that time? And underlying some of those rules and assumptions are what are the product activities that you're privileging behind that. So I can stand up a story page as a designer that has a bunch of links associated to it that can privilege an advertisement and a whole bunch of related links to adjacent content. I know that will get click-throughs and drive a whole bunch of things, but it doesn't necessarily meet the intent of what the design, of what the product experience we're trying to drive for. So it's understanding how to design a system that privileges, that balances the product need versus the audience need. To understand which templates to get pulled up and create a system that's modular enough to balance out that sort of pressure to kind of always be clicking versus just to sit back and watch it. How's that for highfalutin abstract?
Good luck.
Yeah.
It's really noble. How do you execute that?
Strategic motivations. I'm curious.
Oh my. Well, it's really hard in the public sector.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think I currently work in internal IT, corporate IT, so it's even more challenging than creating an argument for citizens, which is a little bit more, gets a little bit more traction these days, but creating a good customer experience for an employee trying to get help, the help desk is more difficult. So, but I think the city's just starting to start having conversations about human-centered design. I think the province is a little farther along from my experience.
Yeah, there's not a digital science. There's a lot of things.
Yeah, it's a real shift, and I think that's part of the challenge with. Part of the challenge, sort of like standing up this model in other areas, is that there's not a clear North Star that we're working towards. It's not like make more profit. So when you hit those decision points at the end of that product management cycle, make more money, make less money, right? It's a pretty easy lens. Are we meeting the needs of Canadians? That's a really hard one to value, and it anchors critically back, I think, into good user experience conversations, but it's a tough one to solve for sure. Any other thought? Yeah?
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, it's more probably specific to my own experience these days at work, but is there anywhere in this whole kind of development, release, test cycle for just training and documentation of what you're building?
No. Yes. I mean, it's the bane of our existence, right? Like, do you love writing documentation?
No, but I find it incredibly useful.
Yeah, and that's, I think, where the overhead gets really. You were talking about how complex this sort of model is, and that's where I've sort of intentionally tried to add more complexity into it by introducing different practices into each of those different phases. You're forcing them to capture information for their stakeholders in a way that's kind of like documentation, but not 100% like documentation. So with the design asset for a product designer to hand over to a developer in an agile cycle, it works more effectively if the designer's documented what these are doing and how this is supposed to act and how this is supposed to behave and what the color patterns are here. And it's even better if they're building off of a design framework that is documented in itself, because the developer can just pick up and run with that stuff. Likewise, if the developer is thinking about how they're going to explain their work to a product manager and a designer in this cycle, they're forced to write their documentation in a slightly different way. And part of the thing that can be successful is not the accuracy or the completeness of the documentation, but the notation level importance in this area. This code does that. This code does that, that code does that, and then people can jump in and have those conversations. By elevating it a bit higher, it becomes a bit easier to write, and it becomes a bit easier to have cross conversations. So kind of like the wireframe that we stand up in a UX practice, it's not really a design, but it's a kind of a design. It can sort of stand as documentation so everyone understands where the header goes and where the footer goes. That high level developer-led documentation, just a tweet worth of documentation in those different areas, enables a designer to step in and say, oh yeah, this is the part of the code that you were talking about that was really hard to do, blah, 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 and that's what's adding all that add code load. So we know that this is the add code bit, and that's the thing that's causing all the problem for delivery. So I think that's where it kind of lands at, and depending on the practice, as part of the completion level or the level of done within a story, that can be added in pretty easily, even as a comment file within the checked-in code, for example. Obviously, with enterprise systems, it gets more complex.
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking like, if I'm doing wireframes that I've got possible storyboard, multiple states,
yeah.
It's like, there's always a nice little column on the right-hand side that describes everything in words.
Yep.
So there's always, if nothing else, there's always that.
And yeah, exactly, and those can be living documents too. So I think one of the interesting things in a tool, if anyone's familiar with it, I'd love to hear about it, but imagining that sort of interface for a Jira level, right, where you have a clickable prototype that allows you to click immediately into where those tickets are and where those things are functioning, to sort of tie those two experiences together so you have that common artifact that you can gather around.
I've been thinking about what you were saying before with regards to the overlap and handoff once between product and design, since I'm a product person. Yes, I'm a product person. Get out. And realizing that I wonder if it's also just magnified by the size of a company, because certainly my experience with startups has been that although there's still other areas of disconnect between groups, I don't so much typically see the same kind of conflict or siloed approach between design and product.
Yeah.
Often the roles are conflated with a single designer.
Yeah.
Or maybe they're just the roles are dispersed in different ways across a smaller team, or it is because they're just so much all oriented towards the external world, like they're just like everything is outward looking. There's less ability to be inward looking when you're a team of 5 rather than a team of 50 or 100. So I'm kind of wondering what your thoughts are on just experiences in throughout your life. Have you seen a difference between the way the model, the various frameworks and its breaking points are expressed in different types of companies you work for?
No.
No?
No.
Same?
It's the same breaking points, and that's the thing that's sort of like I've kind of like pulled back to this over and over again. The breaking points are the same, but the zoom level is different. So if you imagine like a fractal in the startup space, what you'll see is it works really well, but there'll be a couple tensions. Like I use that analogy of Sketch handing off code bits, right? Yeah. That's not the kind of way I'd write code. So thanks for that. I'm just going to go ahead and do my own thing, which adds just a bit of tension and within the development process and slows things down. On larger scales, on writ large, that becomes ginormous. The gaps in there. I think on smaller product teams or startup teams, it works really well, whether it's an incubated within a larger enterprise organization or a startup, because you've got a shared culture, because teams are probably half the size of the people in the room, and we're almost able to have a conversation here. You can move a lot faster. So I can get that you're a product person. I get that you're really weird, but like just deal with like this wireframe and this sort of concept and understand this is what I'm trying to deliver here. And our developer will figure out how to build it out, because it's easy to do, right? Oh yeah. It's like, well, it's kind of hard. Okay, you jam through it and you get it done. Those kind of conversations, as you scale up from product team to organization, you're crossing cultural barriers all the way through. You're crossing organizational priorities all the way through. And that's why I keep coming back to this challenge that I have is that I don't think it's a process, it's a practice. It's a way that we can talk to each other and listen to each other to actually enable things to get done, to find the paths forward across our different organizations.
Well, I mean, that makes sense, because certainly as a product person, a lot of the things that you see as distinct roles, I would say, are not very distinct roles. They're often rolled up.
They're all design, right?
Well, no, they're often all rolled up in an area. Like a good product person actually cares about the business world and the user's experience. Sure. It's not like there's this necessary conflict between the two.
For sure.
So the language can be a barrier, but certainly, as you said, there's no. I don't see necessary tension.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's where the gaps I often see is the pushback, where the defensive position people are going to fall back into. It's like, oh, you want me to do this by when? I'm just the UX person. Like, I'm just going to do out that wireframe and get that done. Or products sort of defending around a particular lens around that area. In the low stress scenarios, everyone can have like happy and warm conversations and get that done.
Right.
But building up that that model across different channels requires a lot of energy and work to sort of share and understand what those needs are and translate them on a regular basis. So there's a heavy emphasis placed in this model in practice in well mature organizations on communication, constant communication, whether it's documentation, notation in that sense, to showcasing or talking to users, or product people exchanging ideas and metrics and sharing that model. Because the more you can share the practice, whether it's a design system template or a product metric template or an interview template, the more people can figure out what these tools, how to use these tools, but identify around the common use of those tools and what they do, not necessarily the formal practice of them.
Makes sense.
It all works in my head. Any other questions or thoughts? Yeah.
Within UX roles, have you seen tension between a product designer and a UX designer, and so to speak,
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how formally it all gets broken down. Like, I think tools become the lens. Some people might be more familiar with building out, say, Acture or one of those programs versus Photoshop, and that gap becomes a bit of a problem. Again, I think it's a scale question. If you have an entire UX department doing work and they hand off to an entire graphic design department doing work, they're privileging different levels of activity, and they tend to be independent because there's not those bridge roles back and forth.
Think we're good?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That
Awesome.
was an
Thank
awesome.
you, everyone.